morning, good afternoon, good day, depending on where you are in the world. Such a pleasure to really rise in this way to share my leadership journey with you. It's quite an interesting one, really full of ups and downs and bumps, but along the way, there were also some moments of encouragement. I really started leadership when I was young, growing up in the streets of Soweto as a child in the 70s, really waking up to the reality of the apartheid struggle in the country. At that time, the liberation fighters were in exile. There was a lot of organizing in Soweto under the leadership of Umama Winnie Mandela. So I grew up on the pavements of Soweto, and I learned leadership at that young age, where I could see everybody was organized and galvanized really around the United Democratic Front, and generally everybody in the country, including us as young people, were part of that journey that says Free Nelson Mandela. So we're singing songs like Oleva Tambo, Tita Nopoda, Kululu Mandela, and you had people like Bob Brenda Fassi also at that time singing those kinds of songs where he talks about she talks about my Black president. So that was the environment that I grew up in Soweto. And at a young age, then I started to get involved in politics, in that way, from the pavements, the politics of students, and the resistance that happened in Soweto, the boycotting of classes, the boycotting of buying certain products, from certain shops and so on. And that sort of shaped my journey of leadership. Fast forward that I then find myself, of course, in school also being part of leading different struggles of students in that way, from high school right up to university. So when I entered my first year at the University of the Western Cape was 1993, I immediately entered into a place of leadership. I stayed at Kasinga residence after a struggle, like all of us when we enter universities, coming from poor backgrounds. I had no money. I remember my father left me 40 rand, and he actually really did it against his will, didn't want to leave me there. But I said, you know what? I want education, I want to study, and I want this for my life. So I will find my way out. So I've been a leader in those ways, going to the matrons in Kasinga, requesting food in the dining halls, and finding my way to sneak into the TV rooms to sleep so that I can be able to wake up and go to class. And eventually sleeping at the sick bay, through my own negotiation with the matrons and telling my story and fighting even for those of us who were sleeping in the TV rooms to say, why are we treated in these ways? Can we be given accommodation and blah, blah, blah. So it's all of that doing that has been part of my leadership journey without even knowing. It's just something that would come naturally. And into the sick bay of Kasinga, and eventually getting a room when I got assistance from Gafeso Trust. And I rise into leadership, I become the chairperson of Kasinga for 1994 until 1996. And outside of the residences at the University of the Western Cape, I also became part of the leadership of the student Christian movement that I was a part of them. Also around 1994 and 1996, I became the chairperson, but I also became the deputy chairperson. So wherever I was, wherever really I made a footprint, my leadership would just rise and shine like that. You know, people would nominate me, I would lead. So I spent a lot of time between 1993 and 1998 being in the leadership echelons of the student struggles at the university until 1998, when I was doing my honors. I became part of the interim SRC, the Student Representative Council of UWC, at a very, very heightened moment, you know, where SASCO, you know, the students were really becoming unhappy about the leadership of SASCO and the politics of the African National Congress, where it was becoming clear that people were just interested in positions, you know, in the higher structures of the ANC. So being members of SASCO at that time meant then that you would necessarily, you know, be working towards your succession into those positions and not really taking care of the needs and the issues that were facing students at that time. Issues of exclusion, issues of residence, you know, those kinds of things, lack of food, and so on. And I ended up in jail, you know, I was arrested as part of the interim SRC at some point, but I did get out of prison, you know, as an activist. So, and I think my leadership was shaping up at that time. I remember meeting people like Mama or Patricia Dilim at that time, because when we formed the interim student representative council, it was a formation of different student political bodies, you know. So you had everyone really except SASCO. You had PASMA, and you had AZASCO, and so on, which is where I met people like Botega Mgokri, people like Michael Canham, people like Nelvis Krekema, who is now the president of AZAPO, and many others. And it was that era of SASCO being led by people like Bojeje Tabani, Fikile Mbalula, Nabuzizi Godwa, and so on. A very, very difficult time. Anyway, so that shaped my leadership as a person coming out of that, really being embraced and mentored by people like Patricia DeLille, something that she probably doesn't remember today, shaped my leadership and strengthened it really at the time when I was at the university. And like any other person, I leave the university because I need to go and work after I did my honors so that I can finish paying my fees. And I get into the world of non-governmental organizations. My issues around sexuality, gender, social justice continue themselves, you know, in those ways. And I find myself in the ranks of youth. At that time, you would know that South Africa had just transitioned from apartheid, so we're developing the national youth policy at that time. And leaving university, I actually start my own business. Believe it or not, I start my own business called J. Perez General Business Services. You know, it's a cleaning company, maintenance, and so on. And I really make it. I get a tender. You know, that's been me just pushing and leading on my own, really. It was a sole proprietor, and I got a maintenance tender to maintain the, you know, parts of the N1 between Johannesburg and Bloemfontein. And it's just like that work of hustling and that work of really just pushing and leading. So I become a businesswoman, young businesswoman. And in that process, I learned about a whole range of things, organizations like your Joint Enrichment Project, organizations like, you know, I get involved in the youth service program. through the Joint Enrichment Project. And I learned about everything, the NYDA, National Development Youth Agency, and a year later, then I was going to start working full time, because of the challenges of running a business, of course, as a young person. And I led into the Joint Enrichment Project as an advocacy and training coordinator and a researcher, because I'm fresh from school. I'm still really into that mode of writing and researching and so on. And that work leads me into the echelons of youth leadership in the country, where then I find myself getting involved in the formulation of the national youth policy in the country, and contributing really greatly into the National Youth Service Program. And what we then engaged with at that time, which was the public works programs that we used to implement the National Youth Service Program to ensure that young people get jobs, especially in the city of Johannesburg. So I was at the forefront of that work, and until I left the youth sector, mainly because of my sexuality, issues of segregation, within the workspace around one's gender and sexuality. My partner then was very, very sick. She had cancer, and I was not allowed to take leave because we were a lesbian couple. And I was like, why? Why is it that other couples, who are in relationships, who are married, who are living together, who are heterosexual, are able to get family responsibility leave, and I'm not able to get it because I'm a lesbian? And that drives me into the pavements of the national coalition that was fighting for the rights of lesbian and gay people in South Africa at that time, because I was looking for people like me coming out and really being embraced. At that time, I think it had changed its name to call itself the Equality Project. And the Equality Project advertises a post similar to what I was busy with, which is work around advocacy, education, and training, and training the public and so on. And I was really, really in love with that work. And I apply, and I get the job. And the position that I played then at the time when I enter the Equality Project is the time when the country is negotiating same-sex marriages. I enter it at the time of the Foreign Bondes case, the two lesbian couples that took to court to ask the court to recognize their relationship as a marriage, and they're being refused. So the Equality Project, we're joining in as amicus of the court at that time. So my job then was to do advocacy work and sensitize communities around that, which put me at the forefront of the media, because I needed to speak to the media. I needed to organize communities, mobilize all over the country, really. And I do that with passion, and that exposes my leadership to the country in ways that are fundamentally deeper, because I'm literally in every province, doing this work and talking to the media, left, right, and center, and so on. And this is work that was going to continue up until 2006. When the Equality Project closed down, I continued that work with the Forum for the Empowerment of Women, which was a Black lesbian organization that is based at the Women's Jail in Constitution Hill, and I integrate that into gender work, sexuality work, and so on. But we're still pushing for same-sex marriages in the country that are equal, basically saying that the Marriage Act must be amended to include everybody, so that it's an equal piece of legislation for all people of all genders. Until the Civil Union Act was passed in 2006. I was sort of at the forefront of that work. So that's my leadership journey, and my struggles, my personal life, my sexuality, my social life in Soweto, the politics of liberation, has shaped that everything that I have become in terms of leadership, in the sense that even as we were calling for these things around LGBTI issues, they were not fragmented from the realities of what it means to be a Black person in South Africa, what it means to be living in the poor echelons of this country. So our struggles were really that, as Simon Goli said, that when I speak as a gay man and when I speak as a Black man, I'm not able to separate those two struggles, because when I'm with my straight colleagues, I get to be excluded because I'm gay. And when I'm with my white counterparts, I'm excluded because I'm Black, And similarly, the struggles that we pushed were really around that. And that pushes me to the forefront of leadership. Until then, we formulated the Coalition of African Lesbians, where this work was now beginning to go to the continent, where we are realizing that we are not just alone in South Africa in terms of these violations. A lot of people on the African continent, are also really being marginalized, arbitrarily so, arrested, murdered, and killed. So the Coalition of African Lesbians comes together after the Sex and Secrecy Conference that took place here in Johannesburg around 2003. And that is just in the middle of the civil union advocacy, heightened advocacy. Everybody was involved. South African Law Reform Commission was involved. Different lawyers were represented by Crystal and Campaigner's attorneys in that campaign. So it's really galvanizing and mobilizing the country, and the churches and the fundamentalists are also pushing. So everybody was speaking, and I found myself in the middle of that. The most interesting thing is that I was also coming from a church background, because I was coming from Christianity, but because of my sexuality, I had just come out of the church. And I found myself in this heightened debate, even with the pastor that actually was my pastor in church, Reverend Kenneth Mishwe, who had now at that point become a politician as well, formulating the African Christian Democratic Party. Contestations even within the church around the role of politics in the church and so on, and sexuality in the church. Even tightens my voice on the public domain, because I'm known as this person that is supposed to be a Christian, but now I've come out as a lesbian woman. And then I'm talking politics of same-sex marriages, and all of that. Those contradictions made the debate more interesting. And I think perhaps that is what made people to follow on his side when I look back. Then we start the Coalition of African Lesbians. I became the first director of the Coalition of African Lesbians, really formulating from nothing. Had to put up offices, had to fundraise, had to put up staff. A mandate really was just saying, you need to make sure that Africa knows that lesbian women exist on the African continent. This is not a Western phenomenon. A huge responsibility, because you're talking about 53 countries on the African continent. So I led that work from the beginning, and put a secretariat in place, approach funders, build relationships with donors, with the support, of course, of feminists and activists on the ground who are also behind this work. People like Elizabeth Kaxas and Liz Frank from Namibia were really instrumental in the founding of the Coalition of African Lesbians. People like Donna Smith, who actually wrote the constitution of the Coalition of African Lesbians, and many of us then that came, into the formulation of that work in Windhoek. A couple of lesbian women that time came from all over the African continent to do this work. So I was at the center of leading that work, and I think was maturing, as this work was just doing and happening and becoming itself on the public domain. My face I was just the face of the struggle, the face of the movement, and a point of reference as well, and around issues of sexuality and gender. And whilst I was in the leadership of CAL just around 2012, 2011, 2010, somewhere there, I get this calling then, to go and be a traditional healer. And I embraced it. It was very, very hard. because the work of the Coalition of African Lesbians took us to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where we needed the African Union to recognize that we exist. It took us to the United Nations, and to the status of women in New York, And so it was very, very demanding work and high level advocacy work that I found myself leading through the structure that we called the Coalition of African Lesbians then. And again, I'm still in the media, I'm still writing, I'm still producing, opinions and submissions, but also shaping and mobilizing lesbians on the African continent, traveling and being literally everywhere. But then I get this calling in Nyahamba, and I go and take initiation to be a traditional healer. It's something that really then refocuses me into the domain of indigenous knowledge systems. And I sort of integrate everything that I had known around sexuality and gender in my life really as a I would say sometimes I wonder whether I should say I'm a politician or I'm just say a political activist. But all of that story that I've just shared with you, from my childhood in Soweto, to church, to university, to the pavements of society, joining in with the women's movement, the feminist movement, through this work that I was doing with the youth sector, with the LGBT sector, I became part of a movement, that largely really sort of aligned itself with the feminist ideological framework of organizing intersectional struggles. So I found myself in the pavements with women's organizations, with feminists, with unions, with politicians, with academics, with researchers, with young people, with people with disabilities, so with people of different, like I found myself in spaces where there's just people agitating and wanting to see change in society, something that I believe in as well. So I integrate then this work of ancestors into this, my calling. Really, at that time, I didn't understand it, but I think as it became clearer when I embraced it, it was very, very clear that it's so much aligned to leading from a place of healing as well, because we are such a wounded people from the struggles of colonization and apartheid. And that's something that was unveiling itself to me as I embraced this spiritual side of myself. And with time, I have been able to integrate that work. And I think as I was working to then integrate that work, and I decided to finish my studies as well, and because remember I had left when I did honors to go and work so that I can pay my fees. And then I lead in that way. I go back and I decide, you know what, I'm just going to take a healing journey, go back, do my master's, and then I do my PhD, which is something that I did from nothing. When you work for NGOs, you literally come out with your jacket. You don't have a pension, you don't have anything. So I didn't have a cent. I needed to sell my house. And that's all leadership, right? Because I'm doing this really with no guidance. I'm just doing it all by myself. And I go back to UWC, I do my master's, and I get a scholarship. I get a grant from the NRF to go and do my PhD in Finland, which I embrace with joy, and I go and do my PhD in Finland. I cut it short and I come back to South Africa to do another PhD in gender studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and that really then takes me into this journey of academia. I studied lecturing in political science, which is a subject of my interest, in public policy. And that gets so easily integrated into my activism. All the work that I've been doing on the pavements literally was just a matter of bringing all of that into the classroom and to theorize that work. Very, very interesting work. And I then start leading from that place, from, as in my voice as an academic, and I'm starting to really write now these things, to research about these things, and to apply varied theoretical frameworks in this work. Very, very independent thinker, autonomous thinker, and I enjoyed the academy because it gives you that ability for intellectual freedom. And I stayed in teaching for about 7 years, and then I saw this post of the Gender Equity Unit Director, a story that is a beautiful story for me as I wrap up, that the Gender Equity Unit, when I joined UWC in 1993, was actually formed by Uroda Kadali at that time. And I remember the position where I stood at the student center with many students who were part of Kopano, fighting for the inclusion of women and gender issues at the university, being mobilized under the leadership of the late Rhoda Kadali. May her soul rest in peace. 1993, and then you fast forward to 2023, 30 years later, I find myself applying for the job of being a director of the Gender Equity Unit, which is where I am now as I tell the story of my leadership journey. So that's what it's been, really. There's a lot in between. There's a lot in between my leadership. I've co-founded organizations, NGOs. I've co-founded collectives of feminist spaces, of traditional healers, of social activists. I participate in these spaces. I continue to do the work that I'm doing that comes naturally. And I'm a board member of different organizations now, sharing my experience really of what I have learned throughout the journey. And I have done this work here in South Africa, on the African continent, and in Latin America, also internationally. So, and that's the kind of leadership that I bring into the space where I am now, which feels very much like I come back home here at UWC, because it's my intellectual home. It's my intellectual home, and I'm enjoying it. I'm very, very happy, and still learning and still growing in this leadership journey. Thank you so much. I hope you have enjoyed listening. See you next time.